So that's me on the left there. I'm the host. I'm also a tutor with the business school and run my small independent consultancy. We have three panelists: Professor Jean Hartley, Professor of Public Leadership at the business school, and Dr. Caroline Ramsey, Senior Lecturer in Management Practice. And we're also joined by Richard Byford, an alumni, and he's Director of 4View, which is a software company specializing in management software. I will now give you an overview of the objectives. Basically, we had this seminar on the 25th of April that ran all day, and during this 1 hour, we're going to try and share some of the learning through some video clips and some polls and from some discussion. And I'm hoping that you'll all be able to gain some insights about your own leadership practice. And the panel are there. You can hear them. You can't speak to them as participants. You can pose your questions, and they'll be looking at the chat, but they will be sharing their knowledge and expertise as we progress during the evening. One note that this webinar is being recorded for public access via the internet, so it's just a little caveat for you. You'll see up the top there the Twitter address and the hashtag, so if you're able to multitask, follow a webinar and tweet at the same time, go ahead, or you may have some thoughts afterwards. So this is a rough outline of the masterclass. I'm just going to ask Jean Hartley if she could just give us a little flavour of what was the reason for this masterclass and what was it trying to get across. So Jean, if you're with us, over to you.
Good evening, everybody. Very nice to be involved in this webinar this evening. The focus of the day in London, the Business Perspectives event, was to try and look at leadership during really tough times that we're experiencing in the UK and in Europe and the USA at the moment. And some of that is the economic tough times that we're in, which also has social and political consequences. So we've got recession, we've got difficulties in the workplace, increasing levels of coercion and bullying taking place, high levels of unemployment, families and communities under stress, and a loss of trust in many of our professions, our politicians, and so on, and a bit of a sense of a loss of hope and sense of direction in society. So the focus of the day was to bring together some speakers, both academic and practitioners, across a range of different areas, from business, from public service, from the voluntary sector, covering both managerial leaders and a political leader, all operating at the strategic level, to really consider some issues about how you confront very difficult, complex problems in organizations and in society, but do that in a way which inspires some degree of hope and courage and optimism for the future. So we looked at leadership very much in terms of leadership primarily as a process of mobilizing attention, resources and practices towards goals, towards values, or trying to achieve particular outcomes. That's much easier said than done. We also looked at the need for leadership to think about distinguishing between tame and wicked problems. So you start with looking at what's the purpose of leadership, what are we trying to do. Tame problems are ones that can be fixed fairly straightforwardly because they've been handled before, and the role of leadership there is a bit like a project manager, a bit more complicated than that, but I'm trying to give a rough outline. However, wicked problems are ones where we don't really know fully what the problem is, let alone how to tackle it. People may not agree how to tackle it. And the job of leadership there is to mobilize people to become involved in the problem and try and work out what it is and how to deal with it. So I hope that gives, I've I've given an outline which is quite abstract. I can talk in more detail about the particular contributors, but I hope that's a useful beginning.
Jean, thank you very much indeed. Well, I hope we're able to convey a flavour of that. Just to let you know, on the agenda we'll be having some video clips from some of the presenters, just simply not time to cover everybody. But you can look on the website to follow up on their bios and the kind of flavour of their story. So I'll now move on to the next slide, which just outlines what we're doing. I've done the welcome and introductions. I've talked about the posing a question and a chat. So feel free to chat away, and we can reply. Members of the panel will reply, or you can reply to each other, and we can look at the questions occurring down at the bottom. Yeah, I think you need to experiment with opening and closing windows and make it comfortable so that you can see yourself. So now we've got the 4 videos here. The approach we have is we show a clip of about between sort of 5 and 7 minutes, and then we're going to have a poll that we launch with a series of questions, and we may talk around those because I think the technology is working against us today, but we'll try the poll questions, then we have some kind of discussion. We then close that, and then we move on to the next video. So I would like to hand the ball over to Janet, who is now going to load up the first video for us. This is a video about political astuteness in tough times, and the video covers some key messages from Professor Jean Hartley.
Here are some of the words that we use when we talk about people being politically astute. And many of us may talk amongst ourselves about recognizing that some managers seem to have a really good nose for politics. Now, the challenge, I think, is that managers and leaders increasingly have to work with a range of stakeholders, and they often have diverse goals and values and priorities. And that means working inside as well as, outside as well as inside the organization. So many managers, whatever their sector, have to work with in strategic alliances and formal partnerships and negotiate the differences in goals and interests and so on. So a report about 10 years ago said that political astuteness for managers was increasingly important. Greater priority needs to be given to developing leaders with the capacity to manage the political dimension. So here we're talking about, if you like, soft politics as well as hard politics. And here's quite a good definition. They need an ability to see and communicate the big picture, make connections, be credible with different groups, and broker relevant political and strategic relationships. So it's about how do you lead in a situation of diverse and sometimes competing interests, when people are sometimes with you, sometimes against you, and you may be working with the same people, sometimes collaboratively, sometimes competitively. In our work, we found that managers, middle and senior managers, often talk about the importance of politics, of working with these diverse interests. And so in our survey, the top definition, if you like, was around politics as alliance building to achieve organizational objectives. Also formal processes and institutions of government, also important ways in which different interests are reconciled, either inside the organization or across a partnership. And there is quite a strong element of self-interest, the dark arts, if you like, people protecting their turf, at least a third of people saying that. Some people saying it's about pursuit of personal advantage. So it's quite a spread of what people think politics is about. Now, I want to very briefly just talk about the skills of political astuteness. And I want to start with a quotation from the book by George Eliot called Felix Holt. Sometimes we talk about politics as though it's a chessboard, and we think about the different players and where they sit. But here is her definition of a much more volatile, dynamic view of politics. Fancy what a game of chess would be if all the chessmen had passion and intellects, more or less small and cunning, if you were not only uncertain about your adversary's means, but a little uncertain about your own. If your knight could shuffle himself onto a new square by the sly, if your bishop, in disgust at your castling, could wheedle their pawns out of their places, and if your pawns, hating you because they are pawns, could make away with their appointed posts, you might get checkmate of a sudden. And she goes on to say, you might be the longest-headed of deductive reasoners, and you'd be beaten by your own pawns. And you'd be especially likely to be beaten if you depended arrogantly on your mathematical imagination and regarded your passionate pieces with contempt. So this is saying that, in a way, that understanding politics requires not just mathematical imagination, not just the technical, rational, fair qualities of management, but also what we might call emotional intelligence. Now, here's the skills framework. I'll briefly go through it. 5 dimensions, all interconnected. The importance of having good personal skills, self-awareness, understanding what makes you tick. You'd find that in any leadership framework, perhaps. Self-control, so knowing when to be passionate and when to be more detached, when to be open and when to be more guarded in what you say, being curious about other people and what makes them tick, and also, importantly, for political astuteness, being proactive. Second dimension of this framework is interpersonal skills. So it's making other people feel valued, building relationships with a range of different people, whether or not those relationships are instrumentally important to you. But it's not just soft skills, it's also hard skills as well. It's about being able to deliver tough messages to people, to be able to stand up to conflict and deal with conflict constructively, to be able to negotiate. Thirdly, reading people and situations. So it's really thinking through what are the different agendas, the different interests that people have and that organizations have. The fourth element is about building alignment and alliances. So it's about being able to, in spite of difference, being able to construct some degree of coalition. And then finally, thinking about strategic direction and scanning. So in other words, where do you want to go? The earlier ones, there's a lot of analysis of other people's interests and goals, a lot of putting yourself in the shoes of others. But this is about keeping an eye on what you need to do and working out when to go fast on that agenda, when perhaps to go more softly. So having a good sense of timing. And finally, part of that, strategic scanning. So looking at for the weak signals in your environment that might signal a change going on that's going to affect your organization. How do people develop these skills? It's quite astonishing. Learning from making mistakes seems to be the top way of developing these skills, which managers say are really crucial skills, but we haven't at the moment got proper development routes to help people develop these skills in ways that aren't haphazard and painful.
Well, hello everybody. Hope you enjoyed that 7-minute video slide. The process we're going to go through now is putting up a poll here, which links back to the skills framework that we saw. Now, this poll is going to run for about 3 minutes or so. Whilst you're thinking about that, I'm going to invite our panelists to perhaps share some perspectives. And I'm first going to ask Richard Byford, if you could share some insights from your experience about the sort of political skills that you've needed in your career in building up projects and companies. What's your perspective on this, especially when times are tough? What kind of political skills have you found useful?
I think most important at the moment for me is building alliances and alignment with other companies, with customer groups and so on. It used to be a straightforward case that there was us and them, us the producers, those the customers. It seems to be a lot more complicated now, and very often businesses are building themselves on a model of competition where they sometimes cooperate and sometimes compete with companies. Sometimes their customers become their competition and so on. Interesting one, things like Facebook, where the customers think they're the customers because they're users. In actual fact, they're part of the production. The customers are actually the people who advertise on Facebook.
Okay, that's very, very interesting. Let's get a contrast from Caroline Ramsey, Dr. Caroline Ramsey. Can you give us, from your perspective, how do you see the importance of political skills, especially as a way to achieve some kind of progress, perhaps when times are tough, especially across all the different management levels? What's your experience of this?
I'd want to stress the politics that is always going on in every kind of moment. We're always persuading or being persuaded. We're always trying to read our colleagues. I sometimes think we run a danger in calling this a leadership thing. It's for somebody who's a leader, when I think it's for us day by day. I'd want to draw our attention to two key elements of it. One is that process of attending to, of noticing. Really develop the skill of noticing what's going on around you, how people are working. We sometimes focus too much on knowing things and not enough on noticing things. And secondly and finally, I'd want to talk about sensing, feeling, not just knowing, not just thinking about and analyzing. Being really aware of the feeling, the climate, the atmosphere that is going on around you.
Okay, Caroline, thank you very much. Yeah, that's very important, and also you need that time and space. Now, it's that point you made on the 25th of April. You know, how do we actually create that time and space to actually give ourselves a chance to feel and interact and read the situation? Before we go to the poll, I'm just looking at our chat to see if our participants have come up with any specific points or any questions. So as and when points occur, do feel free to put them into the chat box or as a Q&A. I'm going to ask my colleague Janet now to confirm has the poll ended? Do we have a final result? Fantastic. Okay, so let's have I'm going to ask Jean to comment in a second. So looking at the bar graph, which I hope you can all see, building alignment and alliances seems to come out pretty much top. Obviously, a no answer at 26%. And then the second one is reading people and skills. Could I ask you, Jean, in your experience, does this surprise you, or do you think this sort of aligns with what your feeling is?
It's 1,500 managers, and also across all sectors, and also looking at research in Australia and New Zealand. So on the whole, people tend to believe that their personal and interpersonal skills are quite good, and that the areas to work on particularly is around building alignment and alliances. And also strategic direction and scanning. Those are the two that come up highest in the research that we've done. I'd just like to say, I think our research also suggests that this is what we might call a meta-competency, political astuteness, that you actually need some skills in all 5 areas to be able to operate effectively politically. I do agree with Caroline that these are everyday skills. The reason why we've linked this to leadership is that our research was particularly based with middle managers and senior managers who are often having to deal with quite complex challenges both outside as well as inside the organization.
Okay, thank you very much indeed for that, Jean. That's very useful. I think for the participants, you could do well to take that skills framework, try it out on your people and see what works. Okay, we're now going to have the second video, which is from Casper de Bono, who's a Managing Director of B2B in Financial Times. So we'll let that run for about 4 minutes, and the same format, we'll have a poll and discussion. So Janet, we're ready to roll.
So what I want to take you through is my personal account, if you like, my personal experience of what strategic leadership means in an industry that is going through a radical restructuring, and the whole economics of what we do in news media has been fundamentally changed and has been changing for the last decade. So from that personal experience, I believe, as far as strategic leadership is concerned, there are three really important attributes. The first is, if you can't beat the odds, you have to change them, which means you have to change the paradigm. You can't keep belligerently believing, almost in a sense of denial, that it's somehow going to change tomorrow. The problem is that in a scenario of high risk and high change, there is plenty of fear. And it's really difficult to be creative when most of us, all of us, are afraid of the consequences. So another test of leadership is how many people disagree with you. How much dissatisfaction and disapproval is there in the industry for what you're doing? Which brings me to the third point, which is the first two are irrelevant if you have no purpose. In fact, the first two could be the definition of madness if you have no purpose. So the third most important aspect of this, and again, the three elements have to work together, is why? Why are you pursuing the path you're pursuing? What is the purpose? What is the reason? Is it worth it? And it's through that that you persuade others to follow you. So my personal belief is that these three things together make up leadership, and particularly in the context of strategic leadership in an industry that is going through some profound changes. Out of curiosity, hands up those of you that bought a newspaper today. Okay, so I would say about 15%, maybe 10. Hands up those of you who read news in some form digitally, so through a computer, smartphone, tablet, email. Okay, so I'd say about 80%. How many of you paid for the news that you read today? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay. So this research on the slide is conducted by the Pew Research Center in the United States. It's looking at the opinions and behavior of the US population. And one of the questions they ask is about the consumption of news and how it's changing. And so you can see that one aspect of our industry, if we think of news as a fast-moving consumer good, the way that consumers are purchasing, if you like, or reading, is changing radically. So 10 years ago, the Financial Times, 80% of our revenue came from print advertising. I think in less than 10 years in the future, 80% of our revenue will come from our readers. So imagine a complete shift in the economics of the business in terms of who is paying the bills. And around about the pinnacle of 2000, we came to the realization at the FT that the economics of online advertising was never going to work for us in isolation.
Hello, back to the poll. It's Peter here, your facilitator. Welcome if you've just joined us. We've now got 184 people, which is a few more than when we started. So I wonder if we can top the 200 mark. let's move on to the poll for this particular video. You heard Casper talking about the 3 things that were driving the changes that he did at the Financial Times. So the question I want you to be thinking about from your development is, which is the most important? To be more creative, to be more courageous, or to actually have a clearer purpose? Because without a clear purpose, the first 2 are not much good. So there's a relationship amongst them. So think about that. I'm now going to ask Richard Byford to give us his take, because Richard, you've been involved in some fairly significant business ventures that required a lot of sort of courage and perhaps going against the odds. What's your reflection on the advice that we've heard from Casper? How does it relate to your experience?
I thought it was very revealing, the fact that you said that the first 2, the creative and courageous, appear to be madness unless you're followed up with a clear purpose. Until you've conveyed that purpose, you will, of course, appear mad to most people. But the interesting thing for me about the video, bit I'm not sure it was included actually, was the fact that there was a huge paradigm shift in the way the FT did their business. And Casper, I was just watching in awe, listening to him describe how he changed the paradigm, and thinking, well, my God, how did he do that? It suddenly became clear as he was speaking that in fact, that he didn't change the whole thing. He was one with the creativity and the courage to first of all stand up and say, we've got to go a different direction. But once he'd made the purpose clear, it was the people around him that reinvented the FT. So it was very much a team effort, but it required that creativity and courage initially to get the ball rolling.
Okay, Richard, thanks very much. Very, very important point. Now I'm going to ask Caroline, what did you take from that video clip, from your experience? What are the lessons you want to share with us?
Well, like Richard, I want to stress the second half of Casper's talk, which we didn't see, which is when he started talking about how he related with and learnt from and got help from his colleagues. And the really important ideas, creative ideas, came from his junior colleagues. And he stressed about that. I think Richard's point is that he noticed he got the conversation going was really important. I'm finding I'm using the word spacious more and more in the way I talk about working with people, about providing space for people to come up with new ideas. And certainly that seemed to be the story that came from Casper. That and just stamina and guts to keep on going when it was pretty damn difficult.
Yes, thank you, Caroline. Just on that point about spaciousness, it's not just a physical space, it's that mental and emotional space where new ideas can come up. And especially, I guess, as the leader, you may have a clear purpose, and I suppose you need that courage to take that risk to perhaps involve people more in and kind of create that space. But how often do we see these spaces occurring in organizations, that sense of spaciousness? So I'll just leave that with folks. Can I ask Jean for a comment, please? How does this relate to, particularly these 3 questions, to the kind of research you've been involved in?
I think it's really interesting. Casper talked about, in relation to the second one, about being courageous. Going with the flow, really, about how much people disagree with you. I think sometimes we present leadership, or there's a presentation of leadership, as though it's all about getting people to agree with you and, develop a full consensus. But I was interested that Casper, and it fits with a lot of the research, talked about disagreement. And there's quite an important theory of leadership by somebody called Ron Heifetz. He talks about adaptive leadership, which is about helping different stakeholders to understand and contribute to new and different ways of tackling problems. And I think what Casper talked about particularly could be classified as a wicked problem. We don't know quite what it was. The need to think about payment for newspapers and news on the internet. Very much a wicked problem. And how he listened carefully to other people. So he may not agree with them, but he's listening carefully and trying to work out what they're trying to achieve, what their interests are, and so on. So I was able to view it very much with a lens of political astuteness.
Jean, thank you very much indeed. I think it's entirely appropriate to do a little advert here for the business school. This idea of adaptive leadership is actually talked about extensively in one of the elective units, which is called BB847, Management Beyond the Mainstream. So, but do have a look at adaptive leadership, because I think it's a growing concept. We're going to look at the poll results in a minute, and I'm going to be asking Richard to comment on that. And Richard, could you pick up the question we've got here from Thomas Cucci, if I've pronounced his name correctly. It says, leading a pack sounds logical, especially for a market leader. But how about the small pawns on the board? So perhaps the companies that aren't in the headlights, like Financial Times. So I'll ask you to bear that in mind. I'm just going to have a look at the poll here. As you can see, an overwhelming majority voted for C, which is having a clearer purpose. So, Richard, could you provide some comment on that, please?
I think the first thing to note is that the leader of the pack, in marketing terms, recent history has shown that they don't always stay the leader of the pack, and very often the company that, or the organisation that finds a better way of doing stuff can simply overtake the leader of the pack with relative ease these days, simply by producing something that the customers want more, are prepared to pay for, or just being generally better than the leader of the pack in many ways. So yeah, I don't think any company, any organisation should ever feel they're in a position where they can't actually pull to the front of the pack.
Brilliant, absolutely. I mean, you could say in tough times, actually, it's the ones who aren't market leaders who perhaps have the ability to be more kind of nimble. Looking at the time, we need to move on. I'll be responding to the questions in the chat tote from Alexandre and Paul Drury, and we'll now move on to the next video.
Why do we need to change? I've taken over as Director General at the beginning of year 2 of a 4-year change programme, so a very clearly defined change programme that came on the back of a number of very critical external reports. But the real driver for change, I think, is the recognition that society in Northern Ireland has changed and needs to change. The highly critical external reports, many of them came on the back of getting things wrong, so either very high-profile deaths in custody or operational failures. But we also had a very comprehensive review which highlighted the fact that as a public sector organisation we were very expensive, performing very badly and not really doing what we were meant to do, which was work with prisoners to reduce reoffending and contribute to building safer communities. The OWA's report, as it's come to be known, was the real catalyst which led to the development of our reform programme. We have an increasingly challenging financial context. Things are worse than they were and they will get worse, so we know that we've got to start to look at our costs and start to deliver more value for money to the taxpayer. I'd been in the job for 4 months when at the beginning of November last year one of our officers was murdered on his way to work. He was ambushed in his car and shot. That also, in all honesty, I think set us back in terms of trying to change our culture. Level of political interest and scrutiny is also significant. In the last 9 months, I've been required to account to the Justice Committee 4 times and I'll be in front of them again next month. So there is a real political interest in what goes on in prisons. So what are we doing? What are some of the practical things that we are doing to change the prison service? One of the things we've been able to do is we've been able to change a very, very significant number of our staff. 360 of our staff to go on a redundancy package to date, with funding for over 500 altogether. It is a very generous package. It allows some of the prison officers who've been in the job for, in many cases, more than 30 years to say, actually, this is not for me, I don't want to be part of this new prison service, and then recruit not quite as many, because we won't need as many if we reform ourselves, but we've been able to recruit a significant number of new officers. The other thing we've been able to do, and continue to be able to do, is to change the built environment. Much of our built environment is very old and coming to the end of its useful life, and we've got quite a lot of money for a new capital building programme. We will be replacing some of our older buildings over the next 5 to 10 years. What we also plan to do, though, is to move with our young people. We've got a prison for young offenders, move to rebadge the YOC, the Young Offenders Centre, as a secure college. So build or have a facility that's based purely on education, learning and skills, employability. And we've said that's not just about the bricks and mortar, but that will be a significant enabler. We're also looking at changes to the delivery of our services. And again, this was alluded to earlier around having contracted out services. At the moment, in the prison service in Northern Ireland, we employ everybody directly, other than healthcare staff who last year transferred over to the local health trust. But we are clear, I'm certainly clear, that our core business is as delivering custodial services. So we shouldn't pretend that we are good at everything. We shouldn't try to be nurses and teachers and counsellors. So we are looking to move to different delivery models for peripheral services is not the best word, but things that are not directly related with custody. The next one of those will be learning and skills. And again, my vision is that learning and skills will be delivered in prison in exactly the same way as it's delivered in FE colleges outside. So we'll start to think of our prisons as another campus of an FE college. And the FE colleges are very keen to get involved in that. On culture change, I've mentioned it already, we've got structural changes to our staffing, changes to our cost base, but the most significant change for us needs to be the culture change, because at the moment we've got a security-focused prison service staffed largely by white male Protestant staff, most of whom were recruited during the Troubles to do a very different job to the job we're requiring them to do today. So the culture change is going to be very significant for us. I mentioned visibility, and that's really important, and I try to be very visible within the time constraints, both within the organisation and outside, in terms of building partnerships and alliances with other organisations. On the whiteboard in my office, I've written "Be transformational, not transactional," and that's just to remind me that in an operational service where I've grown up as a governor, I've sometimes got to keep my hands off the train set and leave that to the people whose job it is to do the tactical operational stuff, and I've got to remind myself that that's not why I'm there, and that I have to start to think big picture as much as I can, and celebrate success. It doesn't really matter, it's just about making sure that we take time to celebrate success and remind ourselves enough that we are doing quite a difficult job, and it is quite tricky, but we don't always get it wrong, we sometimes get it right.
Okay, so that was a very interesting example of practical changes made by the leader who was trying to, I think, transform the situation. Let's look at poll number 3. Again, we'll have this in the background, and I'm going to ask Caroline in a second to comment. Which factors will help create more focus on a transformational and less transactional approach to leadership. And you've got those 5 factors there. And you have to choose one from your own experience. So I'm going to ask Caroline. Caroline, could you maybe pick up on the bit about, Sue in that clip talked about sort of culture change and the leader's role in it. We often hear culture change bandied around as a sort of, as a kind of a cliche. But what do you think is the leader's role in that, from what you've been seeing in the clip and your own research?
Oh, golly. Ask me a simple question, Peter. I guess I am pretty uncertain of the leader's ability to change culture. I thought Sue told us a story of just what a long journey that was going to be. No, she was working in a particular context in Northern Ireland with all the history of that society, and particularly the history of who was in charge of prisons and who was likely to be prisoners there. So there was one very big element that she could start to do in changing the culture, getting more women involved, getting younger people involved, getting people from the Catholic communities involved in the prisons. So those were practical things that she could do. But I sense that probably one of the big issues that is available to us here is actually to raise, the atmosphere, the culture, the climate, call it what you will, as something that is an issue, that this is something we need to consider. Because, of course, so often we're blind to the culture that we're in, the paradigm that we're in. We're blind to it. And sometimes somebody needs to shake that up a little bit and say, hey, we need to think about this.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, very, very interesting. Now let's just have a look. I think looking at time, we'll probably cut to the poll and then cue in our other 2 panelists. So this is where I have to multitask and check the poll has ended. I can't quite see the results yet. Janet, have they come up on your screen? No, I can't see the results, but if my fellow panelists can, I'm going to ask Richard if you could just comment. Can you see the poll results, Richard?
No, I can't.
Yes,
I can. They've just come up.
Okay, what's your gut feel about this, about the results? Because it is interesting how A and D are very, very low. We've got very similar results for B, C, and E. What are your thoughts on that?
I was really quite interested. Sue was inspirational when she spoke at on the day. I think she must have the most difficult leadership role I've personally come across, where she has pressure from peers and pressure from all sides. And we often talk about leaders herding kittens. In her case, they were far from being kittens; they're more like tigers, because there was a huge amount of conflict in the situation she faced, and she was implementing policies, obviously creating an improved organisation. She had a good, clean set of principles she relied upon, but she was in the position of having to implement perhaps some of the policies she didn't completely personally feel bought into, imposed from above. So she had a very, very difficult job. Yes. And she did that, it seems, by really leading with a light touch and resolving conflict. But she always had this anchor behind her of having the principles and the moral standpoint that she was working from. And I think that's very important to have something which is consistently trustful.
Thank you very much. And can I ask Jean for a brief comment? We're looking at time. Could you just tell us something about the poll results? What's your take on that?
I think it's just trying to bring it up. I saw it earlier. I'm not surprised that people don't think external top-down pressure works very well. I think we've seen a lot of that, particularly in the public sector over the last 15, 20 years, and it's got limited effectiveness. I'm a little bit surprised about the pressure from one's peers. I might have expected that to be a bit higher, and I'm just curious what might be going on there. Maybe people can contribute through chat as to why they didn't, or maybe they just thought other ones were more important.
Brilliant, thank you. And just yes, do chat away. And Caroline, could you just comment? I noticed that having more time and space to think strategically, as a point you mentioned earlier, that seems to feature quite highly. Yeah, any thoughts on this poll?
Yes, it was interesting, and we may find this comes up with Stuart Hetherington, the next speaker, on the notion of pause, of leading in the pause. And there seems to be a video coming up any moment now, so I'll stop. Okay,
thank you very much. Okay, now with the final talk is actually from Sir Steve Bullock, who was the Mayor of London Borough of Lewisham. We just didn't have time for Stuart Etherington's talk, but he is very, very inspirational, as Caroline alluded to. So we've got about just over 4 minutes from Sir Steve Bullock.
My theme really today is going to be about optimism and pessimism, and why leaders have to be optimists. One of the things that we've been doing for 10 years and more now is running a capital program which is much bigger than any that we've probably run since the years immediately after the Second World War. It was initially about schools, but it wasn't just schools. It was libraries, it was swimming pools, it was town centres. Now the significance of that is that the statement that makes to people in Lewisham, even today, 5 years into the recession, depression, whatever you want to call it, is giving a very different message about how positive things are. So somewhere in that I have to strike a balance. And the balance that I've endeavoured to strike is one which doesn't take away hope from people. If we work together, we'll find other ways to do things. So I'll give you a specific. We had something like, I think it was 13 libraries in Lewisham. Some of them were absolutely fantastic. It took me years to do it. They opened on Sundays. Staff will never allow it. Actually, we've all changed. We need things to be open on Sundays. We'd got there. But we had some other libraries which were in the wrong places. They were only open half the week, and they were, frankly, a bit run down. The logical solution to this would be to close those libraries and concentrate everything in the main ones, which indeed is what we suggested doing. But what happened then was our residents said, but we like our little local library, even if it is only open 3 days a week. And through a lot of hard work, a lot of discussion, we reached a point where those 5 libraries are now run by community organisations, in some cases a social enterprise. They've still got library books in, and we put those books in, but they're doing a whole load more that they weren't doing before, and we've transferred the buildings to these other organisations. And it was only by not being pessimists and just saying, no, it's awful, close the libraries, throw the key away, that we were able to engage people in that discussion. In the end, if there isn't a strategic view, all of the stuff that you do day to day just doesn't work. The Olympics, Lewisham wasn't an Olympic borough, but the Olympics for Lewisham was the best thing that has happened to us in the 30-odd years that I've been involved. It was things like the day the torch came through and people were 6 deep on the streets, It was the big screen on Blackheath where 7,000 people turned up night after night, and there wasn't the slightest bit of trouble. It was just an amazing event, and it taught us something. It taught us about optimism. It taught us why hope is so important. And the quote that I found was from one of the great Olympians, Jesse Owens, who was the sprinter and long jumper who really annoyed Hitler by winning medals at the Berlin Olympics. And what he said was that we need to find the good, it's all around, find it, showcase it, and then start to believe in it. And that really summed up for me what I'd learned from the Olympics and what I think you have to do if you're going to lead a community, if you're going to try and create the confidence that allows people to go on and do their jobs, to open new businesses, but it's that confidence and that belief and sharing it that makes the difference.
Okay, folks, so that's a very interesting take from a political leader in the borough of Lewisham as mayor there. So this is our final poll with some quite interesting questions. And again, think of it from your own personal development. How can we, perhaps how can you inspire more optimism and hope, particularly in very, very tough times? So I'm going to ask a bit of commentary from our panel. Meanwhile, keep the chat and the Q&A flowing. I think we're just about keeping up. So Richard, can you offer us a comment and perhaps a contrast again with your own experience from the private sector? I mean, do you see any difference between public and private, or do you think the challenges are similar?
Yeah, I think it's very, very difficult to maintain confidence and a positive attitude if you're in a situation where your prosperity is determined from above. So in the public sector, it must be extremely difficult to keep a positive spin on things, but essential to do so. So if you do have something like a key event or challenge to help you bring that up, that's fine. In the private sector, I think it's you make your own fortune. So it's really the case of it's quite easier to, I think, put a positive spin on where you're going. However, very often you'll find yourself in this position where bad things happen. You need to be honest about that sort of stuff, but not honest to the extent that it brings people down. And that's one of the issues I think that came out of the day was that being honest but trying to be positive at the same time.
Okay, thank you very much. And Jean, what do you think, particularly in relationship, I mean, to not just the public sector, but do you think there are maybe some national differences? Because I know that your research has looked at research across different nations. Do you think there are some generic messages from what Steve Bullock was saying, or there's something specific, do you think, for the kind of the UK context?
Some quite specific and some generic. I mean, picking up on what Richard talked about, I think it can be difficult for people in public organisations with pressure from above, but quite a lot of public workers, in my experience, and public managers, gain quite a lot of their hope and optimism from working with the public and with communities and a sense of creating services. That can be really difficult when there's big cuts. But I think it's about, if you like, what we sometimes call public service ethos or public service motivation, which can help people stay optimistic to a degree. Differences between different countries? Yes, I think there's some big differences. I think countries, I'm doing work in Australia, for example, at the moment, and there they don't have much of a sense of recession, partly because they didn't have a banking crisis, and partly because They've got a thriving economy, or at least at the moment, exporting minerals and coal and so on to China, and are building links with China. And it does create a very, very different atmosphere, I must say, both in private and public sector, a much more optimistic society than we seem to have at the moment, which is why it's so important for leaders like Sue, like Steve, to pick up and celebrate where things are going well, and to try to spread some of that optimism, but without being Pollyanna-ish about it. You know, not naive hope, but confronting problems, but still trying to create a sense of purpose going forward.
Okay, Jean, thank you very much indeed. Let's now put what you said in context of the poll results, which I think we can see. Janet, are the poll results available to us all? You should be able to see the results. I hope my colleague Caroline can see the poll results. Are they available? Can you see them, Caroline?
While we're waiting for the results to come up, it reminded me of a conversation that last comment. I was speaking to the marketing director of a large outsourcing company, and asking the question, how do you, when you get these big outsourcing contracts from central government, how do you cut costs? It must be a special formula for doing so. And he said, well, quite often it's just a case that people that we take on under 2P just want to do a good job for the public, and all we need to do is to remove the things that stop them doing that.
Absolutely. I mean, in many ways, I wonder if we have any chat comments about whether the kind of private sector can learn from perhaps the hardships and the sort of top-down direction that we've seen in the public sector, where you're accountable to, you know, in a very significant way. But let's move on to the poll questions, poll results, and I'm going to ask Caroline to wrap up this session on the poll. So, gosh, very, very even. 1% for number D, but A, B, and C, very, very similar. Caroline, over to you.
Yes, they're A, B, and C very evenly split. I think it's interesting that we don't want to change the leadership. I'd love to drill down more into that answer, because I can think of plenty of times when I've wanted to change the leadership. What interested me about Steve was the way he made out some of the conversations that he was involved in, some of the occasions. Do you remember he talked about the screen on the hill, or the Olympic torch going through Lewisham? And it seemed to me that what he was talking about there was he lit on moments of optimism to make them big. He highlighted them. He encouraged people to join in them. To notice them, to feel good about them. And I think that, you know, that might be something about C, about spending more effort of involving customers and staff and other stakeholders. And it seemed to me quite interesting that he wasn't in control of the situation, but his gift was noticing what could turn atmospheres around, what could get the guys working in the libraries more positive about what they're up to.
That's brilliant. I mean, fantastically, very good for you to pinpoint that. Yeah, these moments of the screen on the hill and just focusing on perhaps the things that don't seem to be massive, but actually can be used to kind of unite people. It's interesting, I think, in UK 4, 5, 6 years ago, libraries weren't on the political agenda. Now, they're very much a hot political topic as councils are under pressure to close some, and indeed some councils are opening them or extending them. Righty-ho, let's move on. We've to a wrap-up phase. This is really your final chance to pose some Q&A questions, which I see our panelists have been commenting on. So it's great, the rich discussion in the questions and in the chat. So I'm going to go in the order of Jean, Richard, and Caroline, just to offer some concluding thoughts or pick up on any of the questions or things the messages that you want to reinforce before we start to close. So Jean, over to you, please.
I think we had some terrific speakers, and I hope those video clips have given you a bit of a sense of the fantastic day we had. I think one of the things I would take away from all the speakers was their ability to think about, to be really creative and think beyond the immediate confines of what the problem was. They all had wicked problems to deal with, and they all were good at orchestrating and working with other people to try to address those, whether they were really difficult problems like the libraries or the Northern Ireland Prison Service or the Financial Times, or trying to capitalize on positive things like the Olympic torch or Sue talking about celebrating success. So I think it is that perhaps we don't talk enough about leadership, the imagination needed for leadership. And I think that linked with political astuteness, really having a good sense about where other people are coming from, what motivates them, what they're trying to achieve, and trying to build a sense of direction and coalition to achieve that would be my lessons, I think.
Thank you very much, Jean. Thank you very much indeed. Now move on to Richard. What's your concluding thoughts, please? Well,
I spent the day, the actual day when we were together, and also this evening thinking about the leadership. And of course, we've not discussed the difference between leadership, good leaders and bad leaders. And in fact, there's a warning signal that in difficult times that sometimes bad leaders can also emerge. For example, Steve said one of the things he chose to do was to unite behind an event or something to rally positive thoughts. The counter side of that is that in the case of bad leaders, all they need to do is to identify a common enemy, and you can get a really bad situation springing up from that. So part of the job of a good leader is to watch for that sort of thing happening and spot bad leaders emerging within the organisation, nip them in the bud, align them to something which is positive rather than negative.
Yes, nip them in the bud rather than sack them.
Yes.
Not always the case for football managers, but that's another debate for another day. And Caroline, your thoughts, please.
Well, unusually for this Croydon girl, I can talk about football because Crystal Palace won yesterday. But what I guess overall feeling from the day was the way the different speakers introduced the humanity of organizing. You know, what it's like to be worried, what it's like to struggle, what it's like to be a human being who is just really struggling to get on or getting excited and positive. And linked to the humanity of a leadership process, I think also what intrigued me was also the socialness or the sociality of the leadership. I guess I come from a perspective that stresses social processes and conversation rather than individual leaders. I stress leadership rather than leader. And I noticed that the stories all involved deeply human people struggling, failing and succeeding and hoping. And that seemed really quite encouraging to me.
Caroline, thank you very much. And thank you to our panelists, Jean, Richard and Caroline, for some very interesting and insightful comments. And especially to do this in 1 hour in these 4 snippets. We're just about to wrap up. So let's move on. What's next? The next Business Perspective event is on the 11th of July. on change management, exploring the best and the worst of implementation, and again, sharing best practice. So look out on the website and the invitation for that very shortly. We also have a creativity residential workshop. These have been resurrected. The creativity, whether it's in the creativity elective or as an alumni, has always been a massive strength of the OU, of the business school, and it's backed by popular demand. So that's led by two highly experienced OU tutors, John Evans and Elvin Box. So 14th, 15th June. And there's the website address there. Let's move on. You can share your perspectives on the blog there, openbusinessperspectives.com. You'll also be given automatically by the WebEx system a little survey to fill in, and do feel free to get in touch with us because we value your feedback. So my final slide here is to thank you all for attending. I'm sorry we overran a tiny bit, but it's good to get, we peaked at about 184 participants. So to all the panelists, to all the participants, thank you very much, and look forward to seeing you at a future event. Bye-bye.